All right, guys, welcome back to our next big lecture of the semester. It's another one of those possible essay questions you have, and it is the entire story here, the Protestant Reformation. It is one of the last lectures we're doing this semester. We still have a couple more after this, of course, but it's also one of the more important ones in the sense that the Protestant Reformation has impacts all the way until today. And really, understanding the Protestant Reformation, there's two words in Protestant Reformation that tells you what it's all about: protest and reform. And of course, this involves the Catholic Church. Up to now, since the beginnings of Christianity, there's basically been in Western Europe one dominant Catholic Church. We had the Greek Orthodox in the East, but there's only been one. You had, the Arianism, that was minor. Now you're going to see a pretty dramatic shift in that, and you are going to now start seeing these other reform movements, essentially people upset with the way the Catholic Church is doing things and saying, hey, this is not what Christianity should be, and then they reform, they bring about their different movements. So essentially what you need to know are the causes and the reform movements. You have to know what are the major causes of the Reformation and what are the three major reform movements, how each reform movement developed, what are the characteristics of each reform movement. I'm obviously going to lecture a bit on it here for you, but there's also a lot of good information in your textbook on this and in your primary source reading. So as you organize that essay, I would say of all the essays, that one is probably the most textbook heavy one that, you really want to incorporate something in every essay if you can from the books, either the primary source textbook, but for this one especially, there's a lot of information. If you only rely on what I'm giving you in this video, you're not going to do as well as if you bring in the other textbook and primary source info. All right, so anyway, so that's what we're going to be doing here. Let's go to our map. And here's this massive map of Europe again, and I'll explain the different colors. As I said, there's going to be three reform movements you're going to need to know. They're going to be Lutheranism, Calvinism, and the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. The different colors represent essentially where they are the, spread, the centers of each one. And obviously not everybody in one area is of the same faith, right? You are going to see a lot of conflicts emerging as a result of this event as well. So we'll kind of touch upon that also. All right, so let's start going through the causes, right? Why does the Protestant Reformation happen? Because you don't just leave your faith just easily, right? It's something that's going to be pretty profound. So there's going to be a number of causes. So we're going to go through a couple slides here explaining the causes, and then we'll go through the three reform movements. All right, so these are kind of overview causes, right? Big picture causes of things we've talked about before that are cause of that are the cause of the Protestant Reformation. So in other words, again, things that may have hurt the church credibility, the church authority. And so something like the Great Schism, remember, when you had that in 1378. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of this because we've already lectured on all these points before, but it's good to remember them as causes of the Reformation. So when you had the Great Schism, you had two popes, three popes at the same time, that's going to hurt the prestige of the church. So you have that as an issue. You had the Black Death. We talked a lot about that in a previous lecture in terms of how the Black Death changes the power structure, hurt the church's credibility. That was a factor. The Crusades, maybe to a much lesser degree, I kind of throw that in there as well because they were so much earlier. I mean, the Reformation, in terms of when we're talking about, is primarily in the 1500s, right? The Crusades were hundreds of years earlier. So I think it's hard to make a really strong connection with that. But sometimes students say, what about the Crusades? They were supposed to succeed. They didn't. Maybe that hurt the church a little bit as well. And then finally, a big one that's a no-brainer is the printing press, right? I mean, the printing press, which we talked about, 1455, right? As I just said, the Protestant Reformation is going to really take off in the 1500s. Guys, it's not a coincidence. Were there people before the printing press who wanted to deal with the Catholic Church and had concerns with the Catholic Church? Absolutely there were. But they didn't have the power. They didn't have the way to get the message out, right? There were, they had ideas, but the ideas just kind of died in little local areas. When we talk about the Church of England, for example, I'll give you a good example of that. So the printing press does, again, a couple things. It helps more literacy so more people can read, and then any new ideas can spread a lot faster so people can begin to interpret the Bible themselves, and as they interpret the Bible themselves, they begin to challenge the Catholic Church. So that one needs a little bit of an explanation there, of course, but we've talked about it before. I'm re-emphasizing it because it's so important. So these are some broad causes of things we've talked about. Now, there are other causes as well that we haven't really touched on yet, and now I'm going to kind of go into more detail that you want to know as well. And these are a lot of corruption in the church, right? So I kind of call these causes within the corruption of the church. We talked about this before. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as the church became very powerful, there's going to be a lot of examples of corruption. We're going to go through all of these. You're going to want to know them all. Again, it's not necessarily a church thing. If you have governments that are very powerful, they become corrupt. If you have industries that are very powerful, they become corrupt, right? Look at, a lot of the social media stuff that they're very, monopolized almost in information. Google, for example, is very powerful because they're just pretty much the dominant person. And there's examples of this in many areas, not just the church. And I think that's what's important to remember. So anyways, let's go through all these, and you need to know the stories of each one of these, or the definitions and so forth of each one of these. So we'll start with this guy named Alexander Borgia. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Borgias before, but Alexander Borgia was part of a very important Renaissance family, kind of like the Medici's. The Borgias, however, had a very bad reputation. I mean, they made, we talked about the Medici's and Florence and the Pazzi and the Albizzi and all that crazy stuff. Well, the Borgias make them all look like choir boys, right? Because the Borgias had a reputation, at least, of being very ruthless. In fact, if you want to describe someone as ruthless today, you could say you're a Borgia, in the sense that, Alexander especially was known for doing things like poisoning his enemies. He was accused of having an ancestral affair with, I believe, his daughter. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but definitely people believed it. So you have all of these kind of stories about the Borgias of them being pretty corrupt on many levels. What does this have to do with the Catholic Church? Well, at the end of the 1400s, Alexander Borgia was Pope Alexander VI. So he does become a pope. And this is not the only situation. You have other popes in this time period. You have Medici's who are popes. You have people who become popes who are very corrupt. And this is not what the Catholic Church is supposed to be about, right? This is not what you're supposed to do. And as people see this, and as the printing press spreads this, people are like, oh, wait a second, something's wrong with a guy like Alexander Borgia is the Pope. You don't want somebody like Caligula being your Pope, right? It's not quite as crazy as Caligula, but you get the idea. So that's an example of corruption. Simony or simony, what does that mean? Well, that term basically means the buying and selling of church offices. So what I'm getting at here is, how does one become a priest or a clergy? Well, today you go to school, you learn, you study, you go through a lot of training, and then you enter the priesthood. Back then, what they did is just buy the position. You want to be a priest or a clergy? All right, here, you give the money, some church some money, you get the position. There you go. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is pretty obvious. The problem with that is you're not getting people in these positions that are really devout to the faith, really devout to helping the poor, really devout to helping the needy. You have people that are basically getting these positions. Why would somebody buy this position? Well, power, money, influence. Remember, the church still has a lot of influence. Even though we're in the modern world, we are seeing this influence of the church still there. I don't want to, we talked about this, that the church power just doesn't disappear overnight, right? Even though they are declining, they're still very powerful and influential. So having these positions was very important. Pluralism is holding more than one position at a time, plural. So you would have multiple positions at the same time, which means, of course, you can't go helping the people in your community as well because you're so concerned about, just making money for yourself. One way they made money is through what we call dispensations and indulgences. What are those? Well, we've touched upon those before. Dispensation, they're both essentially the same idea. They're the idea of giving money for salvation. Now, the way this works is as follows. Dispensation is if you commit a sin, you give money to the church removes your sin. Indulgence is when you die in the Catholic faith, you don't necessarily go to heaven or hell. You go to this waiting ground called purgatory. And, when you go to purgatory, it's kind of a waiting ground until you get to either heaven or hell. Usually heaven, hopefully, right? But you get an indulgence, and then that gets you out of purgatory faster and faster to heaven. So both of them are the idea of paying money for salvation. This is going to be important when we talk about one of the reform movements. So anyways, you have those ideas, and what people were starting to see is that these ideas were becoming corrupt, that the money was not being used to help the poor and help the needy. They were going straight to the church. I'm going to go through these last few points, and I sure have a very cool little image to show you that really captures this. Okay, so know that, and I'm going to come back to an image here in a second. Nepotism, what does that mean? Well, maybe that's a word you've heard of before. Nepotism is the idea of giving positions to families. So maybe you buy the position, maybe you inherit it. You have a son and you want your son to be the next leader of that church. Well, you just say you're the leader of the church. Now, of course, there's a problem with that, which is the next point, which is why the heck are they having sons, right? There's this whole idea of non-celibacy in the Catholic Church, and obviously they're having kids. So that's a problem. Now, this is an interesting one because this actually goes back and forth. It does change in the Catholic Church. They're even debating it today. Should priests be celibate or not? In the Reform movements, of course, they're not celibate, right? You can go have kids and all of that stuff. But in the Catholic Church at the time, you were supposed to be celibate, and they weren't. And then relics, again, we've talked about relics before during the oaths of homage and fealty. Everything was a relic, even if it wasn't, right? And the church was selling things that were relics that weren't even relics and making money off of that. So all of these things you'd want to explain, right? All of these are really good examples of the corruption that was really growing in the 1400s that made people question the church itself. All right, let me go to this picture I'm going to show you here, and it's a really good image of this issue of indulgences. So here you have this interesting, I don't know, political cartoon, for lack of a better word, it's called the Hawking of Indulgences. Let me go through this with you. So you see here on this image on the right, and who do you see on the right? A clergy figure. He's wearing nice thick robes. He's got this handful of wheat symbolizing of plenty and enough. He's riding his horse or donkey, whatever the heck it looks like. He's got a little purse here and this big treasure box, okay? So that's one. Then on the other side, you see these two individuals. And if you look at them, how would you describe them? They look like peasants. And, he's got a little coin right here in his hand. And what is he doing? He is taking his basically last coin, so to speak, and giving it to the treasury box to the church, the person with all the money. So, if you think about this and what the church is supposed to be like, this is the exact opposite, right? And this is what this image is doing. It's saying, hey, what is going on here? There is something wrong, right? It shouldn't be the peasant giving money to the church. It should be the church helping the peasants. And images like this were starting to spread, right? It was kind of woodcuts that were spreading during this time period. And people are like, wait a second, what is going on here? So this is a really good example of the corruption of the church during this period of time. All right, good. So I hope all that's clear. All right, so now let's go through our three major reform movements. So we're going to start with Martin Luther, get all these key terms down, and then I'm going to go to a map to show you where he's from. So go ahead, write all this down. This is an image of Martin Luther. He's around early 1500s is when all this is happening. You don't need to memorize exact dates. 1483 to 1546 was his life if you're interested. But, if you just say early 1500s, you're fine. And get all these terms down, and then I'm going to go to a map and talk about all of these terms as we look at our map and talk about Martin Luther. All right, so here's our map again of Europe that we showed you earlier. And Martin Luther was from Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, right over here. And in this area, Germany, Holy Roman Empire, a little bit about his background, and we'll talk about his movement. Martin Luther came from a middle-class family. His father was just a copper miner, nothing more, nothing too high level, very average family. And his father always wanted him to be more in life. And so he encouraged Luther to go to law school, which Luther did. Luther, however, was always a very religious young man. And Luther at the time, he's thinking, I really don't want to do this law school, but my dad wants me to, so I'm going to. So he starts law school as a young man. Meanwhile, one day the story goes, he's out and about, and there's a big thunder, lightning storm. It's pouring. He thinks he's dead. And at that moment, he makes a promise to God that if I survive this lightning storm, I'll devote my life to the church. Well, he does, and he does. He survives a lightning storm, and sure enough, he begins to devote his life to the church. He leaves law school, goes study theology, and by 1507, I believe it was, just looking at the exact dates, he becomes an ordained priest. Interesting, he did this without telling his dad. He basically did this on his own, and some people have said this may have created a bit of a kind of a moral conflict for Luther in the sense that, if you think about this, he's a religious guy. But if he's a religious guy, he's supposed to follow the Ten Commandments. Honor thy father. Did he honor thy father? No, but he's a religious guy. But he didn't honor thy father, but he's a religious guy. So some people said this may have created some bit of a moral conflict for him that haunted him much of his life. Just an interesting point. Anyways, he survives. He becomes an ordained priest. He starts reading the Gutenberg Bible, of course, and as he reads the Gutenberg Bible, he begins to translate or interpret, I should say, a lot of the ideas in the Gutenberg Bible different than the Catholic Church. And out of this, he comes up with a very important document, one of those key words, of course, the 95 Thesis. And in that 95 Thesis, he essentially outlines the key ideas of Lutheranism, right? And how Lutheranism is different than the Catholic Church. He takes this, he puts it on this church door in the Wittenberg Church. I'm sure you can't see it well there, but it was one of the key words. And he nails it right on the church door. He's not nailing it on the church door necessarily to insult the church. That's where everybody goes. Then what really spreads it is the printing press. What are the ideas in it? Well, this is definitely where you're going to read your textbook to get a little bit more information. Anything in your primary sources in your BD book, you could read those, incorporate that stuff in there as well, but I'll give you a little bit. I guess one of the core ideas of Lutheranism is one can achieve salvation through faith alone. And if one can achieve salvation through faith alone, one does not need indulgences and dispensations. And so this is something that Luther went after pretty dramatically. So there's that. There are other things that distinguish Lutheranism from the Catholic Church. For example, the sacraments. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in Catholicism, there are 7 sacraments you're supposed to perform. Luther says, no, you don't need to do all these 7 things. You just need to do 2 or 3, depending on which groups of Lutheranism you're talking about even. And you go, does it matter? 7 sacraments? For some people, that matters, right? That's what makes a religion a religion. And so for Luther, he says, no, you don't need to do this. And the other point, of course, that's a big part of Lutheranism and true of all the Reform movements, is that none of them acknowledge the Pope as the head of the church. They're essentially saying, we don't believe in this hierarchy of the church having this power from the Pope and then, going down below that. We have our own hierarchy. And this also gets us to one of the other kind of causes of the Reformation. I always wait to this point to talk about it because there's one other key factor as to why the Reformation happened. So I want you to kind of follow me on this carefully. There are, in any movement, there are what we call true believers, and there are people who are not true believers but go along with it. Luther was a true believer. Luther really believed in his ideas. But Luther also understood that there were plenty of people around Germany, and again, everywhere you see an orange on this map will be areas where Luther really spreads, and Europe, that may have not really believed in his ideas. They don't really care, 7 sacraments, 3 sacraments, I don't care. But he understood, Luther did, that he could still convince those people to join his movement. Why? Not because they cared about the number of sacraments, but because this was a way to take power away from the Catholic Church. And if you can draw followers away from the Catholic Church, that weakens them. And for some people, they didn't join any of these reform, and this is true of Lutheranism, it's true of the other reform movements, they didn't join these reform movements because they really, really believed that there needed to be a change. They joined these reform movements, some people did, because they just like, I could knock down the Catholic Church a few pegs. And this is again true of any movement. Sometimes I use this as a good example, but socialism, right? There are a lot of people who are true believers. They believe socialism is good. I cover this in History 111 a bit more, that it can, create this perfect society where everybody's taken care of. And there are other people who are like, I don't believe any of this stuff. But if I can convince people that, hey, you get stuff and you vote for me, I'm gonna go jump on this bandwagon if I can get some votes, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, people don't like this. Never mind, I didn't like that movement so much. And you can see this with other examples. I just kind of grabbed that one, but you get the idea, hopefully. And that's true of the reform movements as well. So anyways, those are a few things you need to know right there about Luther. So Luther begins to spread this religion, and what happens? Well, not everybody in the Holy Roman Empire likes it, right? Some people do, some people don't. What does this unfortunately lead to? Violence. One of the characteristics of the Protestant Reformation is this is not a peaceful time in European history. This leads to a lot of conflict, a lot of violence, a lot of death, a lot of killing. Eventually, there's a whole massive religious civil war in Europe over this, and in Germany over this. Luther's going to, of course, be excommunicated. The fighting rages on. Luther dies, and they're still fighting over this. And it won't end until 1555. In 1555, there's a treaty known as the Treaty of Augsburg. And in that treaty, it finally says inside of Germany that in Germany, it doesn't matter. You could be Luther, you could be Catholic, you'd both be allowed to practice your religion and faith. And that stopped much of the fighting. All of it? No. You're going to have religious wars as a result of the Reformation for a long time, right? It's obviously going to rage through the 1500s, 1600s, even in the 1700s. Obviously, it's not a big issue today. You don't see Catholics and Protestants killing each other much today. We talked about this a little bit when we did the lecture on the rise of Islam, and I talked about the Sunni-Shiite conflict, and same idea, right? That for all the issues of conflicts between religions, very often it's people within the religion that are fighting each other because of different interpretation. So that's a little bit about Luther. Make sure you know all that. Make sure you know the characteristics and you read your book and your sources if there are any in your BD book on it, and that should help you out. All right, so again, hopefully all that's clear. Any questions, let me know. All right, let's move on to John Calvin. Now, of the three movements, this is the guy who's got the most interesting idea. So John Calvin, he's actually from Switzerland. I'll show you the map here in a second where he's from. And the ideas we associate with Calvin are not necessarily directly his. They were actually from a man named Zwingli first that Calvin really runs with and grows. And the most significant idea of Calvinism is this concept of predestination. So we need to know what that means. And again, this is all around 1550. So I guess I'll just go to their map and explain all this as we look where Calvinism is. So here's just our map again, and this time just to show you where Calvinism is before I talk about it. It centers right over here in what is Switzerland. Calvin was actually, I believe, from France, but lived in Switzerland. And anywhere you see the purple on this map is areas where Calvinism is going to spread. So what's the deal with predestination? Well, predestination is the idea that the core kind of belief in Calvinism, again, there's information in your BD book, again, read, you're going to need to get more information, is that your salvation has been predetermined from essentially conception birth, right? As soon as you're born, you've already been predetermined to go to heaven or hell. And so I want you to think about this. Let's say I'm going to wave my magic wand here, and you're all listening here. You're all true believing Calvinists. And if you're a true believing Calvinist, how would you live your life if you believe this? And a lot of times I ask students this question, well, I do whatever I want. I go party, drink, steal, rob, whatever. It's all been predetermined. And then I tell the students, well, there's one more point. You don't know. Remember that. You don't know what you've been predetermined for. Only God knows. And so if you live your life drinking, not going to church, partying, lazy, irresponsible, all of those are signs that you have been predetermined for a very warm afterlife. If, on the other hand, you work hard, you live a good life, those are signs you've been predetermined for salvation. Do you know for sure? No, only God knows. So actually, Calvinists live very strict lives. So examples of this that you can probably jot down. Calvinists sometimes we say live good lives more than happy lives. That they work really hard. One of the areas you'll see Calvinists other than on this map, is the Calvinists go to the New World. They're called Puritans. And think of the term, Puritan work ethic, right? If you've ever heard that expression before, that's somebody who works hard. You know, idle hands are the devil's workshop. That's another good kind of Puritan ideology. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. What does that mean? Well, idle hands. You're not busy. You're not working. You're not doing things. That's the devil's workshop. You want to avoid trouble in life, have some sort of good purpose in life, and then you'll do better in life. You won't get in trouble. What gets young people in trouble a lot? They're unemployed. They're not, having positive purpose in life, and they do stupid things. Same idea. So these are things that Calvinism kind of preaches. No sacraments at all in Calvinism, and again, the Pope is not even the head of the church. So it's not quite as widespread as Lutheranism, but it is an important one of the Reform movement. So you definitely want to know about Calvinism as well. All right, that's it. Other than that, read your textbook on it in the primary sources, and you'll be good to go. All right, last one. So here we have the Church of England, or sometimes known as the Anglican Church, right? You want to get all these words down here. And this is the story of the Church of England, which of course is in England on the map. If you saw the previous maps, you know where England is. It's in that little area in yellow there. And of the three, this is the one that's the funnest one to talk about. So what's the deal with this? How does this develop? What's the story? Well, let's start with this. In the 1300s, there was a group of people known as the Lollards. I didn't put the dates there. In the 1300s, there were a group of people known as the Lollards. And they were led by a man named John Wycliffe. And in the 1300s, they were already saying, hey, we need to break away from the Catholic Church. England needs to break away from the Catholic Church. 1300s. Any of you heard of John Wycliffe and the Lollards? Probably not. Because it's before the printing press, nothing happens, the idea dies. But what it does show you is that there were people in England as early in the 1300s that were already talking about breaking away from the Catholic Church. What sets it into motion? Well, it's going to be, of course, the story of Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, he's going to rule over England from 1509 to 1547. In our next lecture, I'm going to do a whole lecture on all the wives of Henry VIII. That's going to be a lot of fun. But for now, we're just going to focus on what happens during Henry VIII's reign. That's part of the birth of the Anglican Church. And so what happens is he wants to get married. And as he gets married, of course, he wants to have a son. And so his wife is a woman named Catherine of Aragon. Now, the first thing you need to know is two things you need to know about his wife, because this is all going to lead us to the Anglican Church. The two things you need to know about Catherine of Aragon is, one, she is from Spain, and two, she's related to the King of Spain. So you need to know that. And then the other thing you need to know about Catherine of Aragon is she was married once before. Before she married Henry, Catherine was married to Henry's brother. Henry's brother died. Catherine became a widow. So Henry knew her. So Henry goes and wants to marry Catherine. He figures it's going to be a good marriage. I can have a son with her. Yay. Well, the problem is she was married to his brother. And so in the Catholic Church, at the time, Henry VIII is Catholic. In the Catholic Church, it says you're not supposed to marry the wife of your brother, period. So what's Henry going to do? Well, he goes to the Pope. And he says, hey, Pope, I really want to marry Catherine. The King of Spain wants me to marry Catherine. It's a good marriage. What do you think? Can you give us a dispensation? Can you give us a blessing that it's going to be okay and God's not going to punish us? And the Pope says yes, because the Pope wants to keep everybody happy. So Henry marries Catherine. Yay. All right. They get married. They try to have a child. They have a daughter. They have a daughter named Mary, right? They have a daughter named Mary. And Henry's like, oh, woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. Why am I only having a daughter? I'm not having a son. They try again. There are miscarriages. And what Henry says, he says, God is punishing me. God has punished me because I married the wife of my brother. So he goes to the Pope. By now it's a new Pope. And he says, hey, Pope, I think the reason I'm not having a son is because of this marriage. You need to give me a divorce. And the new Pope looks at Henry and says, I'm not giving you no divorce. And the question is, why does the new Pope say no? Well, he says no for two reasons. Number one, if he says yes, divorce, this embarrasses Catherine, ticks off the King of Spain, and, the Pope doesn't want to upset the King of Spain. The other reason is if he says, yes, I'm granting you divorce, what he's saying is the previous Pope that allowed the marriage to take place in the first place made a mistake. and he doesn't want to admit that the church made a mistake. So Henry VIII is really upset. The Pope's not giving him his divorce. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? Well, what he decides to do is simply create his own church, right? Now, did Henry really believe this? Did he really believe that God was punishing him and all that? I don't know. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he used it as an excuse. Regardless, he is going to go to this man named Thomas Cranmer. Who is Thomas Cranmer? Thomas Cranmer is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Remember that idea before? Archbishop of Canterbury? And he goes to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he tells him, hey, I want to do this divorce. I want to start a new church. What do you say? And Thomas says, I'm with you. And when he gets Thomas's support, that's it. Now he's got the full support of one of the key religious hierarchy figures in England. And sure enough, he breaks away from the Catholic Church. He then gets a divorce, and then it's going to have a whole series of other wives we'll talk about later. And now the Anglican Church is born, right? And I think there was something called the Act of Supremacy. That was the Act of Supremacy you see there. That was the official breakaway from the Catholic Church. And what's the key thing is it says that the Pope is not the head of the church, that the King of England is the head of or the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England. So it's only in England, and there you go. So that's kind of the birth. It's kind of a crazy little story there, and it's really not completely done because we need to talk about the other wives of Henry VIII, but I'm going to do that in a separate lecture. But for now, I just want you to know how it developed. It's interesting because there are a lot of people who followed Henry and thought, oh, cool, we're going to make all these great reforms to the church now, and very few reforms were actually made because Henry may have only done this because he wanted the divorce. So it's a crazy little story in terms of how it developed. All right, we'll come back to Cranmer as well in another story. All right, that's Henry VIII, if you've never seen him before, so just a picture of Henry VIII. And now, just one more thing I want to talk about here, and it's something called the Counter-Reformation. So if you look at our map here, and you see here again the Anglican Church in yellow, and we see the Lutheranism in orange, and the purple area is is the Calvinism, but most of the map is green, which represents Catholicism, which tells you despite all the problems the church had, despite all the corruption, all the issues, all the reform movements, most of Europe still remains Catholic, Western Europe. Why? Well, a couple reasons. One of the things that takes place is something called the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Reformation, is when between 1545 and 1563, the leadership of the Catholic Church is not stupid. They realize they have problems. They start meeting in a place called Trent. Trent is over here in Italy, northern Italy, and they have a Council of Trent. And in that Council of Trent, they basically do two major things. Number one, they acknowledge there are issues in the Catholic Church, and they say we got to clean up some of our corruption, we've got to clean up some of our issues. They do that. But number two is they reaffirm the ideas of the Catholic Church, that there are 7 sacraments, that the Pope is the head of the church, right? That all the teachings of the Catholic Church are correct, and these other teachings of these reform movements are wrong, and they are heresy. And if they are heresy, then the Catholic Church says, well, then we can go after them, and we could persecute them, and we could even kill them. And so part of what you get as a result of this, for example, in Spain, is the Spanish Inquisition. And this is where I said it gets really bloody and brutal. So again, in your textbook, in your BD book, there's a little bit more on the Council of Trent as well. You could add that in there. Obviously, for your essay question, I'm looking for the causes and the 3 major reform movements. This Counter-Reformation is kind of separate. I believe it's one of your IDs. So you don't necessarily need to include this part in your essay, but it is a possible ID, so you can kind of learn about that. The point of it is that it is important because it does help maintain the Catholic Church having a dominant force in the 1600s inside of Western Europe. All right, so I hope you got all that. A lot of important information there. And again, you really need to supplement this information with things in your book and your primary sources. All right, so we've got a few more lectures or a couple more lectures coming up, a couple fun things. Still important. We still have a couple other lectures that are even going to add a little bit more to this essay when we talk about Henry VIII and his family, the Tudor family. There's going to be a couple points that also tie into this essay. So I'm still going to give you a little bit more information on this, but you have a lot of it. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Study, study, study.